Good evening. My name is Rand Wilson, and I'm an organizer with CHIPS Communities United. CHIPS Communities United is bringing together and building power and strength in the communities that are hosting semiconductor facilities that are being subsidized by the CHIPS and Science Act, which, as most of you know already, is a $52.7 billion program to onshore or reshore the semiconductor industry to the United States. And we just want to make sure that that the communities that are hosting these facilities are going to be kept safe, that the environment won't be ruined, and that the jobs that are created are going to be the good jobs that all of these communities desperately need and that we need in this country. So with that, I'm going to get started by bringing on Lenny Siegel, who is the director of the Center for Public Environmental Oversight. Lenny is a longtime veteran of Silicon Valley and has been a thorn in the side of the semiconductor industry and a number of other industries for decades. It's always been a pleasure to know him, and I'm just going to let Lenny open things up with a short overview of Intel's operations. Lenny?
Well, Intel is one of the oldest semiconductor companies. It was formed by Robert Noyce and others who had left Shockley Semiconductor to form Fairchild, and then they left Fairchild to form Intel here in Mountain View. In 1971, Intel invented the microprocessor, which is essentially a computer on a chip, and they've been a leader in the design and production of logic chips ever since. The original wafer fab was here. They spread their wafer fabrication to other domestic locations, but they've kept their design and software headquarters here. They do some of it elsewhere, but Santa Clara is where they're based and where they do most of the professional work. Like most of the other companies historically, their assembly and packaging has been done in East Asia. Their workforce has always been divided between professionals who tend to be white and Asian men, growing number of women, and women of color who do production. And it's women of color in the US, and it's been women of color in Asia. Over time, as the work becomes more technicians and fewer assembly workers, that may be changing. In the early days, Intel and the other companies didn't pay much attention to what happened to their wastes. And so Silicon Valley is dotted with TCE and other plumes, groundwater plumes of contamination where the companies used to be. So a mile from my house is the MEW Superfund plume from Fairchild, Intel, and other companies. In the 1990s, they set up production facilities in places like Oregon and New Mexico and Arizona and Austin, Texas too. And I don't know exactly when they shut down their wafer fab in Silicon Valley, but again, they kept their design here. In response to the pollution, we organized, Ted, Mandy, others, and us formed the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition. We got some regulation to prevent further contamination from the industry. And Ted and Mandy may have more to say about this, but Intel is a company run by engineers, at least it was back in the day. And although the oil companies just were absolutely against any form of regulation of their toxic releases, Intel sent an engineer. And so they didn't want to be regulated. Once they knew they were going to be regulated, they wanted to figure out a practical way to do that. The industry is driven by what's called Moore's Law. And Moore was one of the founders of Intel. And Moore's Law says you can squeeze but twice as many functions onto a silicon chip every year and a half or 2 years um, for a long period of time. And that's what's driven the industry. So we started out with calculators and digital watches, and now we've got smartphones that can do artificial intelligence. And all of these improvements are enabled by the fact that they can squeeze more and more functions onto a chip. And so right now we're at the stage where they're building features onto silicon that are measured in 3 or 2 nanometers. That's a billionth of a meter. And that's what's driving the industry. Intel may have fallen a little bit behind Taiwan Semiconductor and Samsung, but that's what the industry is trying to do now with these new plants, is nanometer scale production. That doesn't mean that the other production has stopped. There are a lot of older chips, specialized chips, but most of the push through the CHIPS Act is nanometers subsidizing new fabs with nanometer scale features. I know exactly when, maybe 20 years ago, Intel started to fall behind in terms of its leadership of the industry with the growth of silicon foundries such as Taiwan Semiconductor. So Intel and Samsung are integrated device manufacturers. That is, they do design, they do wafer fabrication, and they do assembly in their own company. Taiwan Semiconductor is a foundry, which means Apple Computer or NVIDIA will design chips and they make them for them. And that somehow turns out to be much more profitable. So Intel has fallen behind its profitability. And they've been struggling ever since. Taiwan Semiconductor is one of the most valuable companies in the world these days. Intel is somewhat profitable. They had $56 billion in revenues last year, but everybody kind of treats them as falling behind. And then what happened with COVID is that the supply chain for semiconductors broke down. So you see industries like the auto industry complaining that they couldn't get the chips they needed to make cars. So that, plus the greed of the companies, led to the CHIPS Act. The idea was to eliminate bottlenecks in the supply chain to make sure that chips were available for the industries that needed them. There's a little bit of a lot of disingenuous posturing there, because they're still doing assembly in East Asia. It wasn't like they were trying to bring everything back to the United States. Although with the rise of advanced packaging, we're going to see some packaging done in the United States. We don't know how much. So again, to understand Intel, it is a company that does design, mostly in Santa Clara, but spread around. It has wafer fabs around the US and some other countries, including Israel. And it has assembly in Asia. And that's the company as it is today. There's recent literature about Intel not being as competitive as it should be because of they're doing stock buybacks rather than investing in production. They're paying their executives well. There's some argument that while the CHIPS Act is bringing production expansion to the United States and benefiting Intel, it's not clear that they'll be able to keep doing this if they don't continue to get the subsidies. So it's kind of like an addiction to subsidies to bring chip manufacturing back to the U.S., or at least the preponderance of it back to the U.S. The political instability in East Asia is contributing to that. But Intel's future right now seems to depend upon government money to allow them to expand and compete with Taiwan Semiconductor and Samsung. I could go on for a couple more hours, but I think I'm at my time limit.
Hey, thank you so much, Lenny. That was really helpful. And so now we want to hear some voices with experience with Intel Corporation. And so I'm going to turn to Ted Smith and to Mandy Hawes. Ted is the former director of the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition and the coordinator for the International Campaign for Responsible Technology. And Mandy is a founder of the Santa Clara Center for Occupational Safety and Health and is now the director of Safe Jobs and healthy families. And I believe that Mandy was going to go first, but I'll let this dynamic duo take it from here.
Thank you. The SCOSH project was funded by the Carter administration, Eula Bingham, and it gave us funding, a group of volunteers just trying to get information out to electronics workers in the 70s about the materials they were working with and hazards they might be concerned with. We had a hotline, and an awful lot of people had important questions and shared information. We accomplished a lot, and guess what? When Ronald Reagan became the president, that was the end of the money. It wasn't the end of the fight, because we had collected a lot of information, and it was obvious that workers were being exploited, were not being protected, and needed representation. And whatever we could do, we hoped would be of benefit. So one of the things that was coming across at that point was that there were a lot of chemicals showing up in groundwater. We ran a campaign to ban trichloroethylene, TCE, in the workplace and get control over the so-called safe substitute TCA. Well, TCA was the stuff in the water. It was already causing a lot of problems in communities, and the problems included miscarriages and many other health issues, even though the concentrations were in the parts per billion, whereas in the workplace, these same horrible materials are legally allowed to be present in parts per million. So these PELs, permissible exposure limits, have nothing to do with safety, and it's an inexcusable disparity. The head of OSHA in 2016 basically renounced PELs as having any value whatsoever. Long overdue, but it's true. What we also just realized was, given that most of the workforce were young women of childbearing age, it's a picture of, you see Yvette and Mark, typical young woman who's thought she was fortunate that the industry wanted her. She was an immigrant. She didn't have a lot of skills, but they put her right to work. You find out the hard way what they really wanted. And they were putting women in harm's way consistently with basically, that's how we're going to do it. We ran a campaign with the cooperation of SVTC called the Campaign to End the Miscarriage of Justice. And it involved an effort to make them look at the rate of miscarriage in these facilities. They carried on about, there's no reason, that's ridiculous. Finally, they said, okay, we're going to do it. And Intel was one of the members of SIA, so they were a participant. When the study looked at the rate of miscarriages among women working in production versus in the offices, there was significant difference, way more in the work environment. But because the levels of exposure were well under the legal limits, they tried to say it's just a mere coincidence, which we readily took on, because obviously it was evidence of how poorly workers are actually protected. So they decided, okay, we're going to get rid of this one chemical like all these, there's problem solved. What I remember most about that, because I've been representing workers and their offspring for decades, was that people started calling when this report was released saying, I tried to ask a question about a coworker of mine who didn't have a miscarriage. She had a child with a problem. They got her out of there immediately. That was not allowed, that these issues would be raised. So that was also a big clue, because seriously, any chemical that can cause a fetal loss, a miscarriage, sad to say, is at least as capable of causing something much worse, which is the birth of a child with irreparable brain damage. Because you can't fix it. That's what a story about him. Anybody would do what they could to get another chance if they discovered that their child will never have a normal life. That's a burden that this industry lays on people, and they walk away. So I know we have only a short amount of time. So this has been well known, not just in the US, but in Matamoros, Mexico. But you got to read the literature and pay attention, and that's what they don't want to do. So my final question to this industry, as I don't get an answer, is, would you let your daughter work there? They don't want to answer that, but I think we know why. Thank you.
And I want to talk a little bit about some of the environmental concerns that we learned about from Intel here in Silicon Valley. First of all, they have 3 Superfund sites right here in the Valley, more than any other company ever has. We have over 20 altogether, but Intel is the leader in terms of the number of toxic sites that they have. They did support support the hazardous materials model ordinance that we developed here in the early 1980s. And they were one of the companies that actually came forward and said, you just tell us what you want and then let us figure out how to get there. Don't tell us how to do it, just tell us what you want. And that's always mantra all along. They actually have done more than many of the other companies, and particularly some. I mean, it's hard to imagine that, but in terms of compared to some of the other semiconductor companies in the CHIPS program, particularly Samsung and TSMC, I would say that Intel actually has done more. I see that we have on the call both Mike Guerrero and Lewis Head, who I used to work with in the electronics industry good neighbor campaign going back into the 1980s and 1990s. And I'm hoping we can hear from them. Maybe I can cede some of my time to them, because we worked together on the Semitech campaign, where we were able to get the Semiconductor Consortium to get Congress to put money into making the Semiconductor Consortium actually pay attention to the issues we're concerned about. And we actually had quite a few good campaigns, and they published a really good publication called Intel Inside New Mexico. One other thing I wanted to just mention is that I was involved in a thing called the Common Sense Initiative under Bill Clinton, and Intel was involved in that. At the very end, we had developed what I thought was a very good proposal to have the companies all match their employees with the California Birth Defects Registry and the California Cancer Registry, which would have given us a very quick and dirty epidemiological study. At the very last minute, Intel came in along with IBM and killed it. It was a consensus process, and at the last minute they said, no, we're not going to go along with that, and so it died. It was really a shame that they did that. But I wanted to see if Louis and Miguel, if you'd like to mention a little bit more about what was going on with what you were doing in New Mexico at the time, because I think that was so important.
Thanks, Ted. Yeah, I'll try to just say a couple of quick things. We got involved back in the 90s because of some of the toxic exposure issues that you've talked about. And I know that you were supporting here in New Mexico for many years. There was actually an organization called the Toxic Victim Assistance Corporation that was made up of primarily women of color that were severely poisoned in high-tech industries here in New Mexico. And so when Intel announced kind of what they called a lottery, basically saying the community that gives us the most in terms of tax breaks and deregulation of their environmental laws and water, we'll build a plant and give you 2,000 jobs. So New Mexico, I guess you could say we were the winners of that sweepstakes. And we were basically competing with 5 other cities around the country. Well, it turns out, we found out later that they were doing expansions in all 5 areas, and they leveraged New Mexico for all of the subsidies that we gave them to go to the other communities to get extract additional subsidies from them. So at the time, the Intel plant in New Mexico was the largest construction project in North America, and we gave away huge amounts of tax breaks going back for 30 years of industrial revenue bonds, millions of gallons of water and water rights, billions of gallons of water annually, and in a desert state. And also we were negotiating with them around some of the toxic exposure issues and chemicals, and particularly the air quality issues that were happening in the Corrales neighborhood, which is adjacent to Intel. So yeah, it was a very big deal and set a big precedent here in terms of recruitment and attracting high-tech industries here to the state. We also were able to get clawbacks into the agreements, basically calling for Intel to hire local New Mexicans, local workers at the plant. They violated that at least 10 times over the last 30 years. So they've had to pay millions of dollars to the state because they violated those clawback provisions. But I'll leave it at that. I don't know, Louis, if there's anything else you want to add, but I know we want to hear from you.
We are going to talk about New Mexico
right.
with a group later on, and then we'll have time at the end. So let's,
That's good enough. Mike summed it up real well.
yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thanks, Ted and Mandy. You know, this is exactly what we had hoped for tonight, which is to kind of share these experiences, to learn from one another, and to build a network of folks that are contending with Intel in the various communities where they are located. And speaking of that, one of the groups that's been quite successful at dealing with Intel has been a group in Oregon. And we have Jonah Sandford here tonight from the Northwest Environmental Defense Center. Noah, unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about what's been going on up there in Hillsboro.
Sounds good. Yeah, thanks, Rand, and hi everyone. Great to be here tonight. My name is Jonah Sandford. I'm the ED of the Northwest Environmental Defense Center up in Portland, Oregon. Intel operates two kind of interrelated manufacturing facilities in Hillsboro, Oregon, which is a community just outside of Portland. And all of our advocacy around Intel has, has revolved around these facilities' various air permits over the years. These air quality issues are kind of the advocacy hooks that we've been able to identify up to this point. And I'll share that background real briefly, and I'll be really curious to keep listening to hear what other folks on this call have been able to identify as potential avenues to push back outside of the air context. So just a little bit of background. We in 2013, NEDC, along with our partners, Neighbors for Clean Air, we threatened to sue Intel over some air quality violations at these two Hillsboro plants. And to settle that threatened lawsuit, we entered into a settlement agreement in 2014 with Intel. And kind of a central element of that agreement, among many other things, was the development of what we called a good neighbor agreement between Intel and NEDC and Neighbors for Clean Air. And under this good neighbor agreement, they agreed to a few pretty important things. I think the biggest one was probably the creation of what we call an air quality advisory committee. And this is a committee that's made up of NEDC and NCA and Intel, but also several members of the community in Hillsboro. And that committee holds regular meetings where Intel, is required to provide certain piece of information with the public about the plant's emissions, other activities at those sites. So, basically a chance to provide information to interested members of the community that I think wouldn't be there otherwise. The agreement also required them to conduct quite a bit of additional monitoring at the site, some meteorological monitoring, ambient air quality monitoring, so some additional emissions testing. And then also to make reasonable efforts to reduce their emissions of those toxics. And I think that process has generally been pretty successful. I think the community has certainly had access to more information than it otherwise would have. I think some issues have come to light through this process, such as underreported emissions, things like that I think would have taken a lot more digging to uncover otherwise. In terms of actual reductions in emissions, I'm not as confident saying that, but I think it has been a useful process. And so real briefly, Intel's now planning to expand again at these facilities, as sounds like we're seeing around the rest of the country. And they're going through the air permitting process right now. And we've been very engaged on that front. Intel, I think, at least, outwardly, is acting, they're concerned about being seen as a good neighbor in the community. I think if possible, they would want to have community buy-in on this process. And kind of as a result of that, we've been able to get some things from them through this process. They agreed to pay for one of our experts that we work with a lot to review their permit application and the various studies they submitted along with that, and to pay for our expert to help us prepare comments. Unfortunately, we weren't too impressed with what they've submitted, and we think that they really need quite a bit more, robust monitoring at the site to make sure that they're complying with air quality standards and other permit requirements. But we're now in the process of negotiating, right at the beginning of the process of negotiating a new good neighbor agreement with Intel, where we'll be, pushing for the continuation of this advisory committee, as well as a lot of the things that we unfortunately weren't able to get through the permitting process with DEQ. Primarily, I think this additional monitoring is going to be a really big part of it. So I'll stop there, but that's sort of the brief update on our history of air quality advocacy out in the Hillsboro facilities.
Hey, Jonah, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of follow-up questions about the monitoring and how you were able to secure some financial support from Intel for independent experts. So you've achieved a lot there. We heard earlier from Michael Guerrero about a little bit about the battle back in the day with Intel's facility in Rio Rancho. And now I want to turn it over to Dennis O'Mara and Marcy Brandenburg, who are the co-chairs of Clean Air for All now. Marcy and Dennis?
And I'm deferring to Marcy on the better part of our time here, and I'll chime in at the end.
Sure.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name's Marcy Brandenburg. I was born and raised in New Mexico, but left for 27 years and returned in 1999, not knowing at all what had been happening with the Intel facility. We opened up a coffee store, a drive-through coffee store, about 1/8 of a mile north of Intel. So our windows were open 12 to 14 hours a day while we were operating. And I moved here at 40 years old, healthy as you can be at 40 years old, and began to experiencing really crazy illnesses. My first migraines that would go on for 30 days at a time. And after about 2 years of just sort of wondering what the hell was wrong with a customer came in through the store who lived in Corrales. And I told him how bad I had been feeling and what I'd been feeling. And he said, gosh, there's a whole bunch of people down in Corrales you really need to talk to, because they've been discussing this for years. So I immediately introduced myself to the group Corrales Residents for Clean Air and Water and became a member right away. Since then, I have our goal, Dennis and I always felt, since I lived in Rio Rancho and I worked in Rio Rancho, I felt that Rio Rancho had been neglected and Corrales had been focused on because it was right below Intel. But I felt that people in Rio Rancho were also suffering, just not knowing why. And so I started to reach out to people that I knew. A dentist I knew that had her business just right across from my coffee store is now in her last stages of metastatic cancer. And she said, her email to me is, I'm so sorry, you were always right. You should have listened to you. I was a realtor. I'm still a realtor. So I was faced with not steering people, but also informing people. So thank heavens at the time, Ken Hamidi, I don't know if anybody recognizes that name, but he had a lawsuit against Intel that went to the California Supreme Court, which he won, which is extremely rare. And he had a website called faceintel.com. And so I would have my clients go to faceintel.com, and then they would call me and say, never mind, I don't want to live anywhere near that facility. So thankfully, most of my clients live way, way far out. Nobody ever said they wanted to live there. So right now, as Clean Air for All now, because we realized it wasn't just Corrales, it was Rio Rancho, it was Northwest Albuquerque, We reorganized to Clean Air for All now. We are currently monitoring. We have 9 monitors deployed, and we're looking for more monitors. Dennis is doing mad research on monitors that would be appropriate for the chemicals that Intel uses, people that might even be willing to lend us monitors because of our financial, we're just grassroots, very small organization. Our big goal right now is community outreach, because there's so many of the public that do not understand that facility that sits across from them or next to them, or that they drive by every day. Even chemicals, minor chemicals that wouldn't seem like very much on a low level on a continual basis, are harming them, their family, their children, their animals. We've had necropsies done of dogs, of horses, and nothing has changed. And in fact, we operate under a minor source permit here in New Mexico. So Oregon, hello, you guys operate under a major source permit, and they still got busted for not operating for 63 days. That's 9 weeks that they were allowing raw chemicals into your air shed. They've been fined for it, I do believe. But my point is Intel is the only sheriff in our town. They tell the Department of Health what to do. They tell the New Mexico Department what to do and what they're going to do. One last thing I want to mention, Boiling Frogs, Intel versus the Village by Barbara Rockwell. It's a must read. It's a technological book, a scientific book, a historical book about what they went through in the 90s to get Intel to be the good neighbor that they always purported to be. And everybody should be reading that book. But so that's where we're at. Nothing has changed. I truly don't believe, because they are the only sheriff, when they say they're running their cup scrubbers and their thermal oxidizers, I don't believe them. They didn't do it in Oregon with a major source permit. They don't have anybody checking him here. No oversight, no regulation. So that's where we're at.
Thanks, Marcy. Dennis?
Yeah, I shared some of this earlier with another subgroup of CCU. The way I would characterize Intel with regard to managing their air pollution emissions is that they only do what EPA allows them to get away with. And by that, I mean, I use another euphemism. It's one and done with Intel. They treat their waste streams, whether they go to thermal oxidizers or to scrubbers, one time. And then whatever is left, and in terms of the thermal oxidizers, whatever results from burning all the natural gas, all of that comes out. And they want us to believe that they are abating in the high 90s of the chemical streams that go into scrubbers and thermal oxidizers, and we don't believe it for a minute. And of course, what we have been advocating for all along is that Intel should go beyond what minimal requirements exist in their permit and employ and deploy hybrid equipment, which would involve treating emissions multiple times before allowing anything to get into the air. And of course, they are not interested in doing that because it would cost money, and they don't have to do it. It's nothing like that is required. So that we're sort of at an impasse. And so, as Marcy said, one of our primary purposes in Clean Air for All now is to try to inform the community as best we can about what's happening, what Intel is doing to their air, and what risks that poses to their health.
Dennis, can I cut you short now?
Yeah, sure. That's good.
Get to the next community and pick this up in the post presentation discussion. Thank you very much. Incredible perseverance by you and others in New Mexico for decades. Really appreciate that. Going to turn it over to David Matusow, who has been a resident of Chandler for many, many years and a longtime environmental activist. David, unmute yourself, take it away. Good to see you.
Yeah, long time. Yeah, I got into this. Actually, I lived out here in Arizona, moved to North Carolina, moved back a year later. Long story there, but moved into my house, and literally, I think it was a couple of days or within the first week that we moved in, and I basically had moved basically a mile east from where I had lived previously. It was a Motorola plant. Unlike Silicon Valley, though you guys also have Motorola plumes, Motorola is the worst actor out here. And just like New Mexico, we're a desert, so very short on water, especially lately. But anyway, so Motorola decided to put in a fab. This was basically adjacent to where I lived, not next door neighbor, but just 2 blocks down the street. Got the community together, and we basically stopped that for about 5 years, about a $750 million fab. That goes back to the early 80s. As a result of my stuff with Motorola, Intel was building a fab down in Ocotillo, which is South Chandler. So they decided, probably smartly, keep your enemies close and your friends close and your enemies closer. So they decided at the time, the EPA had a project called Project Excel, and the idea was to sort of short circuit a lot of the regulatory requirements. Basically get the community together, get all the regulators together, and work out all the details there, and then issue the permits on what was agreed to. I don't think Arizona is any different than most communities because it was basically a matrix regulatory process. So you had, the EPA from the Fed side, you got the ADEQ, Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. You've got county level, which takes care of the air emissions. You've got the city of Chandler, which was taking care of water resources. There's also a state water resource board, but most of that was done by the city. And obviously, cities are not tremendously, wealthy, enterprises. So that was sort of a short-circuited thing. In addition, we had electrical that had to go in because these plants can't be turned off ever. It takes them weeks and weeks. I mean, this goes back years. It's probably longer now. But the cost of shutting down one of those plants because of a lack of electricity is staggering. Anyway, so the XL project went on for, I think, about 2 years. They came to a final agreement, which I refused to sign off on, and had everybody, including the administrator of the EPA, calling me up and begging me to sign. Intel built, I think they're now up to building their 4th fab down in Chandler. I moved out of Chandler about 20 some years ago. I live north of Phoenix now, in a rural community, and found out that about 2 years ago, TSMC was building a fab. Started out building 2 fabs at $40 billion. They're now up to 3 fabs at $65 billion. They're building this. I mean, Rand's been out here. It's sort of out in the middle of nowhere outside of the fact that it's got an interstate, a few hundred yards from it. But it's wide open, which is why they moved in there. They worked out an agreement with the city of Phoenix as far as water goes. I don't know where Phoenix is going to find all this water, but that's a whole nother problem. But yeah, I mean, what ends up happening here has been, said earlier, is people don't understand what's involved in these plants. They walk by them and you don't see black smoke coming out of them. You don't see, ambulances going in and out of them. We did have a contractor worker was taking away waste materials who died. That was a couple months ago, I think.
Hey,
But
David, I'm gonna have to ask
Sure.
you to
Go,
wrap
go,
up,
go.
we'll move on and get to the more general discussion. I'm looking forward to the call that we have with TSMC and with your counterparts in Taiwan. So I am going to post the environmental, what is it called? Lenny shared this with me. I put it in the chat. It's Intel's environmental assessment for, or a draft environmental assessment for their expansion in Chandler. It's
Yeah, it
pretty
says
in-
draft. I think that's actually about where it ended.
Yeah, okay. Okay, Dale, I know your hand's up. We're going to get to you in the general discussion. Just now I want to bring on Ken and Carol Apacki from Glendale, Ohio, or sorry, Granville, Ohio, excuse me. Longtime residents there who, with the siting of a massive Intel facility next door to their community, helped found Clean Air and Water. And Ken and
Okay,
take it.
we are the juveniles on the block. It's a grassroots effort that started in February of 2023. The meetings have been with core group, some email lists, some newsletters, some yard signs and flyers. Passions were raised in the residents, mothers and teachers, never before involved in village or county issues. The village and township officials encourage us to ask critical questions because they are silenced by the grandfathers. The initial issue started off with infrastructure. An asphalt plant was being proposed on the outskirts of Alexandria, on the aquifer, and then a second asphalt plant was coming a mile away at the other end of town. And when I calculated the amount of traffic, the 6,000 tons per hour from the plants would create 3,000 trucks a day coming through the town when they are paving the third lane on the highway in each direction for 30 miles.
24 hours.
24/7. So the EPA felt like it had to have an air permit hearing, and 150 people showed up for that. And a few weeks later, 75 showed up for the Licking County Planning Commission, and the permit was delayed until a week ago or so. Then along comes a year later, a wastewater treatment plant wants to come in on the edge of town to service all the future development of manufacturing and residential areas in the 9 miles between the plant and the service area. This brought in 230 people last Tuesday night to complain to the EPA not to give this NPDES permit. So
do you mean Ohio EPA? Do you mean Ohio EPA or US EPA?
Ohio EPA. Okay. So both the threats are to local drinking water, our aquifer, and the quality of the water in the area. We've sent technical letters to challenging Intel on its emissions. It was ignored, probably because it had the wrong tone. It was very aggressive. We are now backing up to creating baseline air and water monitoring and plan to have a long-term community air monitoring network before and after Intel production starts. Intel production will probably start in 27. We'd like guidance from the rest of the communities on what chemical emissions to target with our sensors. The researchers who are developing the monitors have a way of plugging in different sensors. Right now we have VOCs, particulates, NOx, and a few other little things. But should we be trying to get hydrogen fluoride or chlorides, or what else should we target? We have a committee that's addressing monitors, siting, volunteer hosts, data management, tech support. Tell me what you've done and what should we be planning for if we're going to have a long-term air monitoring system? And then should we really plan to become a 501c3? Is that necessary, or can we have hosts for monitors buy their own monitors and give us the data? That's where we're at right now. We're trying hard, and we really appreciate New Mexico talking with us. Dennis Amaro and Marcy spent a lot of time with us. And in Ohio, Ellis Jacobs gave us a lot of time and guidance. So we're looking for guidance. Thank you.
And Lenny Siegel spent an hour with us, our whole group, really giving us a wonderful overview. I'm very appreciative.
Hey, Ken and Carol, thank you for everything you're doing. And you've raised a lot of important questions. I kind of doubt they're going to get answered tonight, but
Yeah.
you're in the right
Our emails
room.
are in the chat.
Yeah, you're in the right room, and I'm thinking that you know, we're going to be reconvening this again soon, and we can go into these questions a little deeper. I just want to bring Ellis Jacobs on. He's a longtime attorney in Ohio and is doing some interesting research there concerning the Intel plant. Ellis?
Yeah, thank you. Hey, Ken, Carol, I'm not sure I've given you all that much great advice yet. I'm learning a lot about this myself, and it's a great opportunity for me to learn from all of you. All of you are focusing on critical issues, and there's so many of them associated with these giant facilities. I'm going to try to specifically focus my work in this arena on the climate impacts of these giant facilities. You all know better than I about the nature of the chemicals, and in addition to their toxicity, they also have, you know, dramatic climate impacts. These facilities also burn a lot of natural gas, and they use just a boatload of electricity. It's my understanding that the one that they're building in Columbus will probably use an equivalent amount of electricity as 400,000 or 500,000 homes. And so then Intel makes this show of the fact that they're an advanced company, and by gosh, it's going to be 100% renewables. But when you dig into it, and not very deep at all, you discover that they intend to meet all of that, as you all know, probably through the use of renewable energy certificates, RECs, which is kind of an accounting game that doesn't really get any local new renewable energy built. And when you're in the area that we're located in, the PJM electric grid, buying RECs from, you know, out west or whatever, from a facility that was built years ago, does absolutely nothing to alleviate the new load they're adding to our electric grid here without actually getting any new renewables built. So my thought is that there's such a giant chasm between what they're sort of telling people they're doing and what they're actually doing, that we can probably build a campaign here in Ohio to shame them into doing something better. And there may be some legal levers along the way. I don't really know about that, but I welcome the chance to learn from all of you about your experience in this arena. To the extent any of you want to get engaged in this particular little piece of this critical work, I'd be welcome the opportunity to talk with you. And I put my email, ejacobs767@gmail.com, put it there in the chat. So thank you.
Hey, thanks, Ellis. Well, that was quite a comprehensive overview of what's been happening in the Intel host communities. And I think we've barely scratched the surface in terms of organizing approaches, air monitoring ideas, getting resources to undertake the work, and ways in which we can collaborate together to maximize the concessions that Intel is willing to make to each of the communities that are hosting these facilities. So I'm really excited to hear from each of you. And I think this is the kind of networking that is going to make Intel a little bit nervous that we're coming together. It's long overdue. So Dale, you've had your hand up for a long time, and I appreciate that by looking in the chat that you've had also some interesting and direct experience with Intel in Oregon. So why don't you kick it off with our open discussion? Dale?
I'll see if I can do it in 2 minutes. We'll see if I can do that. Topics I want to cover. This is being recorded. I hope you'll share the recording.
It is.
I think there's a correction. Most of the research now for Intel is done in Washington County in Oregon at the D1X. That's their research center currently. So anyway, I think that's a true statement. In 2010, Mike Rogaway wrote a full 2-page article in the Oregonian, the main paper in Oregon, and it was entitled "Oregon Embraces Intel, but Environmental Doubts Persist in New Mexico." And I got involved in that and studied every one of his links and learned a whole lot. He's a very good investigative journalist, still is. And on that link was also the fire marshal list of all the chemicals in 1 year that Intel has out. So I went on and I got all the list of chemicals that Intel used from 1998 to 2017, because it's required, at least by Oregon, I think by federal law, that the industries that have a certain amount of quantity and dangerous chemicals have to report them to the fire marshal. And the fire marshal then has to report that to local fire people so they know what to deal with when they go to these plants when they have an accident. And so that was very informative, and I got all their chemicals through those dates. And Intel did say on their application that they participate in a local emergency planning committee. They don't. They didn't in Oregon because it was a farce. And so the outcome is I went to the fire marshal in Hillsboro and asked him, is there such a thing as a local emergency planning committee? He said, committee? He said, no. I said, is there one? Can I participate? He said, no. He said, anyway, the outcome is from 2015 to 2022, we got a local emergency county-wide, and 41 industries in the county then have site-specific emergency plans that were written. And I'm trying to get those so that they are out to the public so they'll know what they're dealing with next to these sites. So that's intent. Now,
Yeah,
Intel,
can I ask you to wrap up so we have some time for others?
yeah, I sued DEQ based upon anyway, how do I wrap it up?
Yeah.
I wrote Brian Krachenitz, Intel, 3 certified letters I finally got to him and he replied to me. The former executive Intel. I got a lot of stuff on Intel.
Well, sounds like you have a lot to share with us. So anybody else want to jump in? Unmute yourself and share some information. Yeah, Lenny, go ahead.
Just that we're about to begin drafting our comments, which are due August 6th on the draft EA for Intel in Chandler, and would appreciate. We'll send a link to the draft as we develop it, but we appreciate input from people, not just people from Arizona, because the same information and policies are going to come up elsewhere.
Everywhere.
So that's a great idea, Lenny. Let's, if people are interested in looking at that, we'll circulate that to everybody that's on this call. See a hand from Zach. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I know that Intel just announced recently that they're not going ahead with a big expansion in Israel. Here in Ohio, they've delayed their plant by about 2 years from what they initially said. And I'm wondering if there's any analysis being done or what the big thinkers on this call think about whether Intel is in fact going to be able to go ahead with all of these giant plans, or whether we're going to see further delays or even cancellations of some of them because of the enormous cost, even with the government subsidies.
I think I saw a headline today that chip stocks crashed quite substantially,
Yep.
just in the last.
Yeah, but they said that Intel stock did well.
Oh, okay.
There are all these ups and downs, and you can't look at the day-to-day reports.
Right.
In the long run, I expect Intel to build its greenfield plant in Ohio, but it'll be slower than they originally planned.
Yeah, that's what's happened out here with TSMC. They were originally targeting this year. They moved that into next year. I think there's still some rumors about maybe doing something, probably some sample runs late this year, but they're looking at 26, 27, 28. Yeah, I mean, the thing is the costs are huge, but I mean, it's just like, we talk about the energy, requirements, and here in the Phoenix area, not only do we have these guys going in, plus we've got the TSMC here with 60 some billion dollars. We got Intel with 30 some billion. Micron's looking at doing something out here. You've got all their suppliers. ASML is putting in a multi-billion-dollar investment out here, but then you've got data centers. Understand, I'm a software engineer, so I live my livelihood is based on these chips, and yet I still have to fight them.
David, I'm gonna share that link to the video about how Phoenix and Arizona are kind of ground zero for all of this. But I want to give time for some others.
Oh yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, I mean
the
the thing is the amount of power that those guys use way exceed these chip plants. So
Right.
it's you're getting hit by multiple places.
Yeah, the situation in Arizona is certainly
Fun.
challenging. Hey, Lewis Head, great to see you. It's been a long time. Unmute yourself and bring it on.
All right, likewise, Rand and everybody else, a whole lot of faces on this call that I haven't seen in years. I have a question, and Rand, maybe I'll start with you. Has there been any kind of progress anywhere at all in terms of labor organizing with any of these companies beyond? I know there had been progress with buildings trades in some places, but that had to do more with construction phase. I'm talking about production workers.
Well, I'd say ground zero for that right now is with Samsung in Korea, where the workers at Samsung have been on strike now for nearly a week, and it's an indefinite strike. And I saw a letter today that Ted circulated expressing solidarity with the workers in Korea that are facing Samsung. And Samsung, as you know, or may have heard, is undertaking a massive expansion for their facilities in Austin, Texas, and a new fab plant of gargantuan size about 20 miles to the east of Austin in Taylor. But semiconductor workers throughout this country, country are largely not yet union.
And Judith and I put the news in there about Akash.
Yes.
Don't forget Akash.
Okay, well, Greg, now that you brought it up, why don't you finish that sentence?
So you see a link to a Bloomberg article and a note from Judith Barish. We have a victory in West Oakland with a new younger company called Akash, which has agreed to a project labor agreement for the construction of its new facility and a neutrality agreement with the Communications Workers of America for the permanent production workers.
And in a company, I think in Gresham, where did we have a walkout recently? Where people had a march on the boss. It was Analog Devices, and it's in Portland, in the Portland vicinity, and workers there were pissed off about the skimpy raises and long hours, and so they Beaverton, Oregon. Thank you, Judith. Analog Devices in Beaverton, Oregon. It's a company that's headquartered where I live in Massachusetts, but workers there had a march on the boss, and they were supported in that by IUE CWA, which is one of the founding members of CHIPS Communities United. But that's not the focus of this call, but I'm looking forward to the future, Louis, when we might have Intel workers from all of these facilities network together on a Zoom just like this. I see a couple of hands, Ted and or Mandy. I'm not sure which one of you wanted to jump in.
So COSH groups like the one I mentioned earlier are active in a number of places around the country and could become a helpful ally in trying to break down some of the complicated issues about toxic exposure and what people can do. And if that has any interest, either to folks on the call or people you are reaching out to, be happy to share what we've got. Because the chemicals just want a job. And they're, if they're hazardous, however they're being used, people have a right to know that. By the way, big quiz, what was TCE used for before it became a cleaner in this industry? It was an anesthetic gas. Figure it out. Thank you.
One additional thing I just wanted to mention about Intel, since this is an Intel call, they have been a founding partner in a thing called the Clean Electronics Production Network, the only semiconductor company that's in there. And that has a goal of zero exposure to the workers throughout the global supply chain. So it's something that is actually, I think, potentially a significant impetus in this whole def. And one of the things that has just happened is that the CHIPS office has incorporated 2 of the projects from CEPN into their BMPs and the TSMC site. So I was quite surprised to see that, including the guidance that we've come up with for health and safety committees in the plants. So again, Intel is somewhat different than many of these other companies, and I think that's worth noting.
Thanks, Ted. Did you post a link to that in the chat?
No, I'll do that right now.
Yeah. I see a hand from Felina, who I recently met in Phoenix. Felina, unmute yourself and introduce yourself. It's great to see you.
Michpancinco, Nanotoca Felina Rodriguez. I am one of the community organizers here with Donatira Community Development Institute. And so I am here listening into the call and learning as much as I can about the ongoing battles regarding Intel. I mainly just had a question related to a lot of the organizing efforts across what I'm guessing is the U.S. I'm just wondering what relationships have been established with the indigenous communities in your home states in regards to utilizing treaty law to leverage against this ongoing semiconductor industry, because I actually have the book right here that was the 1990 study, and I've been slowly going through it, Sacred Waters, which was a study of the 4 different places. But one of our ongoing international efforts has been combating geoengineering, especially because while we are going into what is known as the green economy, we are facing a lot of these new green movements at the expense of indigenous peoples, especially with the semiconductor industry and with the newly found lithium mining sources in the Southwest. There is a lot of potential for the United States to attempt to utilize eminent domain and continue to expel people off of their indigenous territories. I'm here in O'odham territory, and my family's ancestral homeland is the Yaqui territories of the Rio Yaqui, which is currently dry because the capital city of Hermosillo in Sonora is withholding all of its water, likely in preparation for the lithium mining that is going to happen with the new lithium field that was found in Sonora. So because it has been historically proven that lithium, just the mining industry in general has been utilized to continue to displace indigenous peoples. And when we talk about the health concerns and the health risks that have happened, historically, it has hit our communities first. Our communities are the ones that were enslaved and forced into the mines all along the Yucatan Peninsula. And even in the Southwest, we were the first ones to be displaced from all of our homelands for the sake of what we call civilization. So I'm just wondering, how indigenous communities have been included in these conversations, especially when it comes to labor, because what the U.S. likes to call immigrant labor, we call migrant labor, because we're indigenous to this continent, regardless of that colonial border. So that was one of the things that Donatira has done historically, is not only leveraging treaty law and leveraging international law at the United Nations, and also engaging with centering the caretakers of the lands here as we continue to do the work. especially because it has been proven in multiple studies that when Indigenous peoples are in partnership and take care of the land, that is when we see the most return and sustainability efforts. So especially with these industries, especially the tech industry being the newest evolution of the extrapolative mining industry, I'm just wondering what those efforts have been.
Wow, you've raised a lot of really great questions, Felina. There's some responses in the chat about relationships with the Onondaga Nation in Syracuse and the Tonawanda Seneca nations there as well. But you brought up a lot of, a really good point about an opportunity. I know that folks in New Mexico, I don't know if Louis, if you can respond to that, or Michael jumped off, but I know that they've had quite a bit of experience there relating to the Native community. We're kind of over our time. It's 9:09, and all of New Mexico is indigenous land. Yes.
Yeah,
Good point.
yeah, it's
Point well taken.
Rio Rancho is surrounded on several sides by pueblos, and the whole issue of water use and water depletion is a huge issue for indigenous communities here in New Mexico. I mean, thanks for bringing that up, Felina. We didn't really go there 30 years ago. We were very tight with Tonatiuh and the work that Tonatiuh was doing. And we were just trying to introduce some of these things into our thought, but we very much treated Intel as an assault on indigenous and all land-based peoples here in New Mexico, and a continuation of this development model that has existed ever since the United States came over and militarily occupied this place, and settlers came in, and you get this whole thing of growth, but growth for whose benefit, who pays for it and who benefits. And Intel ended up being a major engine of that. So in a state that has been forever majority black or brown and black, and acknowledged as such finally by the census in 1990, we were always looking at what are the impacts of this development on people of color and indigenous people.
Thanks, Louis. So I kind of want to, I know I've got a couple of hands, but I really want to try to wrap up the call. And I think that there's clearly, a lot of issues that we need to be getting deeper into. Issues about water, air quality, labor. Greg posted some links to issues regarding, subsidy abuse, tax issues. So there's just a lot of stuff that we need to get under, and 1 hour isn't going to do it justice. But two things I'll propose. One is that we'll share everything that's been posted in the chat. We'll share the video to this of this call, and we will, if people are interested, if I get a thumbs up, maybe in say a couple of months, if it's relevant and pertinent, we'll set up another Intel Communities call and have an agenda that will allow us to delve a little deeper into the issues that have been raised today. So I'm seeing one thumbs up. I saw a thumbs up from Ted. Let me know if anybody else is interested in that. Dale says yes. Felina, yes. So I think that constitutes a quorum. We will look at putting together another meeting like this. Oh, there's Adam suggesting that we get together. Great to see you, Adam.
New Mexico's in too.
All right. So let's plan on reconvening and working on an agenda that will allow us to delve a little bit deeper and to have a broader conversation with one another about how we're organizing and what we're winning, what we're demanding from Intel and what we're winning from Intel. So with that, I'm going to wrap up the call, And
Before you do that, Rand, just thank you for putting this together. This was a long time in coming. It's a tremendous group of people, and I think we're all excited about really moving this forward. So thanks.
well,
Second
you
that.
know, it's just a plug for CHIPS Communities United. Visit our website. And, you know, our mission is really to build power for the communities that are hosting the facilities and for the workers that work there. And, you know, together, we can prevent these companies from whipsawing the communities, and we can look for gains and concessions that will improve the environment or minimize the impact on the environment and protect the workers from the health hazards that they might experience, as Mandy brought up so eloquently. So I just want to thank everybody. It's great to meet all of you, and we'll reconvene in a couple of months. And hopefully we've made some progress in a lot of these areas. Great to meet everybody.
All right.
Thank you.